Thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here, Dr. Gordon's invitation, and also to be here with my friend, Dr. Fisher, who I've known much longer than he'd care to acknowledge, as I'm a Iowa City native. So that being said, how many of you in this room have seen the movie Thank You for Smoking? Raise your hands. Okay, very good. I am a lobbyist. So I am not necessarily that guy, but I am the person that stands around the State House rotunda and spends a great deal of time dealing with state legislators as well as folks in the governor's office. So if you can kind of get that visual image in your head. Just out of raising your hand, how many folks are political science majors here in the room? Okay, now how many folks are history majors in the room? Okay, this gives me a pretty good idea of who I'm dealing with. One of the things I'd certainly encourage everyone to do is certainly be a critical thinker when it comes to tax policy. There are a lot of different kinds of information out there. Anytime you see a chart or a graph or any type of information displayed, always look on the bottom of the page and check the source of information with regard to tax policy. There are a lot of different places, both for federal tax policy stuff as well as the state policy. You know what, Dr. Fisher did a very good job, I thought, of talking about regressive tax. Sometimes the best analogy I can use is if you go to the Come and Go and you got a six-pack of your favorite beverage, for people in this room, the amount of tax you would pay compared to your income would be significantly different than the amount of tax compared to my income. So you start thinking about regressive tax. That would be one analogy. The other thing I do want to point out, one of the slides that Dr. Fisher pointed out, you know, as far as individual income is concerned, you got to be careful when you talk about that 1% tax bracket. There's some 70% of taxes, at least on federal income, are paid by that 1%. One of the things I do want to point out is I know that some of the reading that was required for today was my statement of policies. If you haven't read it or you'd like a paper copy, you're certainly welcome to stand up and come down to the bottom of the room, and there's paper copies of our statement of policies. The other thing, the Iowa Taxpayers Association, just as a background, is a nonpartisan business tax group. We're based in Des Moines. We have 160 members, and they're all businesses. Subchapter S, LLCs, partnerships, C corporations. I also have a website, www.iowataxpayers.org. And then just a personal note, if you'd ever care to email me, Wallace@iowataxpayers.org. And again, that's on the back of the pamphlet in the front. One of the things that we do, because we don't have a PAC, Political Action Committee, and we don't endorse candidates, is that my members spend dues monies to hire me as their lobbyist, as well as some clerical staff, to take a very good look at the governor's budget recommendations as well as the legislature's budget decisions. One of the things that we do every year is we complete a review of the governor's budget proposal as well as what happened at the end of the year, and you can find that on my website. This year we were relatively hard on the governor with regard to his budget recommendations. It was our feeling from an ITA standpoint that Governor Culver spent a lot of time and energy focusing on recommendations from a consultant that we didn't believe had the ability to become a real-life conclusion. So that being said, we didn't think that the numbers added up very well on his recommendations. My Committee on Accountable Government will spend time and energy coming up looking at what the legislature did as they passed their $6.2 billion budget. One of the other things that we're very proud of in our 75-year history of ITA is having principles for sound budgeting. And basically, we apply the principles to the white paper report that we put out. And again, you can find those on the website. As far as principles for sound budgeting, we always ask that policymakers, both in the executive branch and the legislative branch, look to avoid the use of one-time or time-limited sources for ongoing expenses, stimulus money. Avoid implementing new programs for a partial fiscal year. Avoid multi-year accelerating commitments. Avoid new and automatic appropriations. In other words, putting something on autopilot. Accurately determine revenue and expenses, much as you have to do in your budget and your folks have to do in their budget. Align expenses and revenue in the same fiscal year. And avoid shifting program funding to pay for property taxes or fees. And that's something I'll touch on here briefly. That is what I believe that this legislature has done, is that they have kicked the can down the road for FY 2011, and that folks in the county are going to see that start of April of next year with levies being raised. And then last thing is avoid diversion of funds that are statutorily authorized. We have a road use tax fund that's constitutionally protected, but in Iowa we have something called a Rebuild Iowa Infrastructure Fund for vertical infrastructure, for buildings, for universities, buildings, state buildings, that type of thing, and constantly this legislature is taking that money from that pot and putting it in the general fund to pay for the bills. It's like anything else. You have a budget here at school, all of a sudden, yeah, I'm not making it, bam, I hit the credit card. And that's something that the state has been doing time and time again. The other thing that, as a white paper group and as a group of folks that try and be as nonpartisan as possible, we talk about principles like equity, neutrality, promotion of growth, revenue adequacy. We understand that you need taxes to pay for the different things that we have here in the state of Iowa, but we shouldn't have too great of taxation to pay for things that either we don't need or are duplicative. And that's something we get ourselves into a dialogue a lot of time with legislators talking about reorganization of government. We have 99 counties here in the state of Iowa. We have 360 school districts. I look around the room and I have to guess that many folks here from urban school districts or possibly from out of state or possibly from smaller school districts. We have about 3 million people in the state of Iowa, and the math doesn't add up. And one of the things I think that we're going to have to address with policymakers moving forward is the 99 county system the best way we want to go forward. The other things we think about are accountability, efficiency, and taxpayer involvement. One thing that's really nice about Iowa is that we have one of the best voluntary compliance rates in the United States. We have an agrarian work ethic. People work hard here. They pay their taxes, and then they remit the taxes to the Iowa Department of Revenue. So that's a good first step. One thing I want to touch base on is Dr. Fisher was talking about the tax credits and the proliferation of tax credits. In February, myself, Victor Elias, who's aligned with the Iowa Policy Project, as well as Iowa Senator Joe Bolcom, Democrat from Iowa City, we're all on a television program. If you go to iptv.org and then you click on Iowa Journal for February 4th, I think you get a pretty good primer on what tax credits do and don't do. And then you also get a good dialogue for somebody that represents business, somebody like Victor that represents children and families, and then your own Iowa City Senator Joe Bolcom. So I encourage you to go on there as well. As this session started, you all would have probably heard about the 10% across-the-board cut that Culver had implemented via executive order. I know every single Regent University here in the state certainly felt that cut. Culver made a decision to go with the 10% across-the-board cut because constitutionally that's the only thing he can do, unless he would have brought the legislature back for a special session. And because he decided not to let the legislature incrementally make their picks, we had the 10% across-the-board cut. So when the Iowa legislature came into session, they knew that they'd have to backfill in places like education, mental health, and some of these other different initiatives. And so that being said, they also, at the start of the session, was a tax credit panel that was put together to examine tax credits in the wake of a film tax credit scandal. And I know Peter and I will talk about that a little bit. We kind of agree. So a lot of times Peter and I don't agree on things, but that is one area of tax policy we do agree on. And Peter testified, I testified, a bunch of different experts testified on what tax credits should stay and how they should work. And that happened December 15th and 16th as we headed into the January start of the session. This session was 80 days long. Typically it's 100 days or 110 days respectively. That Democrats control the governor's office, the House of Representatives, as well as the Iowa Senate. And that being said, they all came in knowing that the budget was going to be the number one priority, given that we've had about a $500 million loss of revenue due in part to this economic calamity that we found ourselves in. A lot of pressure on whether or not we were going to have any tax credits administered from any of the programs administered by the Iowa Department of Economic Development and the Iowa Department of Revenue. That being said, some of the recommendations we found not palatable at all, which have been the loss of refundability on something called the Research Activities Credit. Many of my companies that are based here in Iowa do an incredible amount of research and development of their products and services all around the state. And the state has a very generous program for that. They hire young college graduates. They hire scientists from across the United States to come in. Those are well-paying jobs, well above county median wage. And those are the types of jobs of the 21st century. And so we want to make sure that that credit stayed in place and intact. And there were other recommendations that we found difficult as well. Eventually, to sum it up, there was legislation, and I don't think anybody came out happy. The bill was signed by Governor Culver over at the old Capitol last week or the week before. But that being said, I, on a personal level, didn't believe that the savings was there that they were looking for, and I think that we sent an economic development message across the United States that Iowa is meddling with their tax credit program when other Midwestern states are saying, let's expand our program given the economic calamity that we're in, and let's make sure that we're providing quality jobs and expanding our offerings to businesses, some of the largest employers in the state, so that they can hire young graduates from Regent universities, as well as bring people in. Again, we've still got 110,000 unemployed Iowans, which is about 6.7%. While that's pretty good compared to the United States, it's not good for Iowa in my estimation. One of the bills you might have heard about was a government reorganization effort, and this is where I'd like to give kind of a shout out. I don't know if you know this or not, but you have a lobbyist. University of Iowa has federal lobbyists. University of Iowa has a state lobbyist. And your state lobbyist is outstanding. One of the things that they did was they got with President Mason and some of the officials and said, there's a provision in the government reorganization bill that we just cannot live with. The provision was to take computer operations, IT, and have one IT czar in Des Moines. Well, University of Iowa, Iowa State University, and UNI have all kinds of teaching hospitals, research laboratories, federally funded science facilities. Absolutely no way that one person in Des Moines could take care of all of that IT. It's very, very sensitive information. And so the lobbyists for University of Iowa, and as well as the other region universities, were able to strip those provisions out of the government reorganization bill. I thought that was pretty impressive, demonstrating what's going on. The other thing is the government reorganization bill purported to save some $70 million. Eventually, in my estimation, that $70 million was spent the last couple of days of session on many of the different pork and pet projects that the folks wanted to put in something called the standings bill, and that's the last bill in the session. I will applaud the legislature. They got out in 79 days, and they said they'd do it in 80 days. I was pretty impressed with that. The other thing, there was one issue that we care deeply about at Iowa Taxpayers Association, and that is the Statewide Property Assessment Appeals Board. Okay, that's a mouthful, Ed. Well, here's what it does. If your folks have a acreage or a home in the county and or a business, and they don't like their assessment, they go ahead and appeal that assessment to the county assessor and the appeals board on the county level. If they get a decision back that they don't like, they can then appeal it to this three-person panel called the Property Assessment Appeals Board in Des Moines. You don't have to have an attorney to do it. This is something we help create. It's a state agency. Look it up on the website. And what we've seen is a proliferation of cases where businesses and residents have been having their property assessed improperly. And this is something that's been very important to us. In that government reorganization bill, there was a provision to just completely get rid of this board. Iowa Taxpayers Association and other business groups said, no, wait a second. Let's keep this in the hands of the people. And we were able to keep that back in. Due in part to the budget scenario that we're in this year, we were not able to couple, and this is kind of complicated, but couple with IRS changes. So what happens on the federal level is they make all kinds of changes, and then the state has to couple with them in order to stay aligned. One of the things that happened this year is there has been about a $34 million fiscal impact to the state if we were to align with all the federal changes. So because of that, we decided, the legislators decided they weren't going to do that. Something else popped up, Motel Tax. Do you have anybody in the room from Chicago? Anybody from Chicago? We got, I see a couple hands. All right. When I go to visit some of my member companies in Chicago, and I stay for 1 or 2 nights, and I look at the hotel bill, oh my goodness gracious, all these different little teeny tiny county tax, excise tax, local municipality taxes. It drives me insane. One of the things that folks are looking at for additional revenue sources is to have additional hotel motel tax, so that you would tax travelers that come through the state instead of the folks that live here in Iowa. That did not go anywhere, but I think the big push there was for the Cedar Rapids folks that have lost so much tourism after the floods of 2008. Just a few other side notes on the legislative session. Peter talked a little bit about labor. Because one-party domination of the State House and the Governor's office, you would think that labor would rise to the top and labor's agenda. There were 4 different bills, and one of them is called prevailing wage for public projects. You have a set wage. Another bill is employee choice of doctor. You get hurt on the job, you get to have your doctor instead of the one that XYZ company says you got to go to. And then there's another one called fair share or right to work, which means if you don't want to join a union, you don't have to. Well, the bill that they had said you have to pay the dues even if you're not a union member. Those are 3 different labor bills. And there's one other one called collective bargaining. In other words, collective bargaining units having greater powers. So all these are pro-labor ideas. And good for folks, you would think. Well, a lot of these, we found out, would be very, very costly to businesses, and businesses that are having a hard time employing people or taking employees that they've laid off and bringing them back. So despite the Democratic control of both the House, the Senate, and the Governor's office, none of these things passed the last 2 years, which politically, for my political science majors here, is absolutely insane. You would have thought coming into 2006 with control of everything that the pro-labor agenda would have played out, and it didn't. So that's kind of something to take away from the session. One thing as I look around the room at some relatively young folks, one thing I can't impress upon you enough is for lobbyists like myself who stands every day and talks to legislators, there's nothing better than somebody representing their communities and being somebody that's trusted in their communities to come up to Des Moines. It's a thankless job. It pays $25,000. You're there for 3 months, and you got people like me hammering on you all day long about X, Y, and Z. But this year there's about 18 retirements. And you should look and see some of those communities if you know who the representative was and maybe who some of the candidates are, because I certainly implore upon you to remain active on all those different types of things. And let me kind of leave you with some thoughts, at least on the budget. You heard me earlier say, well, we kicked the can down the road. I believe that we did. We have a $5.3 billion general fund, but we use $724 million of one-time money, aka stimulus money, for ongoing expenses. That's like your Uncle Ed ends up giving you a bunch of money and you put it in your regular stream of revenue to pay for everything from rent to groceries to the bar bill to anything else that you're up to. So that is certainly not something we want to see at the state level or at the federal level. And the federal level obviously is a different quagmire because we've got so much deficit spending. But at a state as small as Iowa, we need to be very careful of that. The other thing I'm predicting is there's going to be a shift to property tax, greater property tax burden, both commercial and residential. It was something in Iowa called the rollback. You only paid 49–50% of the assessed value. But my corporations and my mom and pop shops that make up my association, those folks are kind of taken in the face because there's greater amounts of money to pay for the services at the county level, which means what's the county have to do? They have to raise their levy. What does that mean? That means that the business owner is going to pay more money and perhaps have even less service. So that's something that's important. One thing I will concede is that nobody ever says, I want less service from government. Everyone always says, I want more service from government. The big question is, how do you pay for it and how do you prioritize it? If you look in my statement of policies when you're out of class, we have a very long section on property taxation. Our whole thing is if you go to a fee-based taxation or you go to these hotel motel taxes or franchise fees or excise taxes, please designate and let the people know what it is that you're paying for, so that you're not just throwing money into a big pot and then nobody knows where it's at and the people see a greater tax burden down the road. One thing, just for kind of housekeeping, if anybody is in and around Des Moines this summer, I have something called a biennial tax seminar. I think we may have some seniors in the room. That is something where it's a great networking event with people that are part of some of the top 100 companies in the state. If you would email me and would care to attend, I would make it free. June 28th at the State Historical Building in Des Moines. Again, Iowa Taxpayers Association Biennial Tax Seminar. And then that kind of concludes my remarks. The only other thing that I would point out, I've kind of been all over the place on this, is that it's my belief that over the next few months you're going to see a lot of rhetoric on tax policy from a state perspective, both from the 3 Republican candidates for governor as well as Governor Culver. And as critical thinkers that I know you are, I implore upon you to read through the plans and take a good look, because if you've got friends or family or whatever that are part of the solution here in Iowa, many of those decisions are something that could have long-term effects for businesses as well as individuals. So with that, I conclude my prepared remarks and defer to Dr. Gordon.